The Arrival. The sun was setting as the group of friends arrived at the edge of the remote forest near the Dead Sea. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. Jake, the unofficial leader of the group, stepped out of the car and stretched his legs. "This is it, guys. Our weekend getaway," he announced with a grin. The others followed suit, unloading their gear and setting up camp. There was Sarah, the practical one, always ready with a first aid kit and a map. Mark, the jokester, whose laughter could lighten any mood. Emily, the quiet observer with a knack for noticing the little things. And Tom, the skept who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "So what's the deal with this place?" Mark asked, poking the fire with a stick. "Why is it called the Dead Sea Forest?" Jake leaned in, his face illuminated by the firelight. "Legend has it that this forest is cursed. They say that long ago, a group of settlers vanished without a trace. Ever since, people have reported strange sightings and eerie sounds. Some even claim to have seen the walking dead." Tom scoffed. "Come on, Jake. You don't really believe that, do you?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know, but it's a good story, right?" Just then, a distant howl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down their spines. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just a coyote," Sarah said, trying to sound confident, but the unease in her voice was unmistakable. As the night wore on, the group tried to shake off their nerves and enjoy the evening. They roasted marshmallows, told more stories, and laughed at Mark's jokes. But the strange noises continued, growing louder and more unsettling. Eventually, they decided to call it a night. They retreated to their tents, the fire slowly dying down, but sleep did not come easily. The forest seemed to come alive with whispers and rustling leaves. And as the moon rose high in the sky, the true horror of the Dead Sea Forest began to reveal itself. The first night. The forest was eerily quiet as the group settled into their tents. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Despite the unsettling noises earlier, exhaustion soon took over, and one by one they drifted off to sleep. Jake was the first to wake. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and glanced at his watch. It was just past midnight. He listened intently, trying to pinpoint what had disturbed his sleep. There it was again. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering, like the wind carrying secrets through the trees. He unzipped his tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The campfire had long since died down, leaving only glowing embers. Jake scanned the campsite, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Everything seemed normal, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Guys, wake up," he called softly, not wanting to alarm them. "Do you hear that?" One by one, the others emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. "What is it, Jake?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Listen," Jake said, holding up a hand. The group fell silent, straining to hear. The whispering was unmistakable now, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the edge of the campsite. "That's creepy," Mark said, trying to make light of the situation, but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "Maybe it's just the wind," Tom suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It doesn't sound like the wind." Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, sending a jolt of terror through the group. "What the hell was that?" Mark exclaimed, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay together," Jake ordered, grabbing a flashlight. "We need to find out what's going on." They huddled close as Jake led the way, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scream had come from deeper in the forest, and as they ventured further, the whispering grew louder, almost deafening. They reached a small clearing and froze. There, in the center, was a figure standing motionless. It was their friend, Tom, but something was terribly wrong. His eyes were vacant, and his skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent hue. "Tom?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly to face them, his movements jerky and unnatural. "We need to get out of here," Jake said urgently. "Now." But as they turned to leave, they realized they were surrounded. Figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The walking dead, just like the legends had warned. Panic set in as the group tried to find a way out. They stumbled through the forest, the undead closing in on all sides. The whispering voices seemed to mock them, growing louder and more sinister with each step. Finally, they burst through the trees and back into their campsite, gasping for breath. "What the hell is happening?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his mind racing. "But we need to stick together and figure this out." As they regrouped, the whispering faded and the forest fell silent once more. But the terror of the first night had left its mark, and they knew that the horrors of the Dead Sea Forest were far from over. The search begins. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on the group as they gathered around the remnants of their campfire. The air was thick with tension and unspoken fear. "We need to find Tom," Jake said, breaking the uneasy silence. "Whatever happened to him? We can't just leave him out there." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "He's our friend. We have to do something." Mark, usually the joker, was uncharacteristically serious. But what if? What if he's not the same anymore? What if he's one of them now? Emily shivered at the thought. "We can't think like that. We have to believe we can save him." They quickly devised a plan. Jake and Sarah would head north, while Mark and Emily would search the southern part of the forest. They agreed to meet back at the campsite by noon, hoping to cover as much ground as possible. As Jake and Sarah ventured deeper into the forest, the eerie silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every rustle and snap made them jump, their nerves frayed from the night before. "Do you think the legends are true?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes scanning the shadows. Jake hesitated. "I don't know, but something is definitely wrong with this place." Meanwhile, Mark and Emily were having their own unsettling experiences. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their path. "Mark, do you see that?" Emily whispered, pointing to a faint light flickering in the distance. Mark squinted, trying to make out the source. "Yeah, let's check it out, but stay close." They approached cautiously, the light growing brighter as they neared. It led them to an old, abandoned cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. The door creaked open as they stepped inside, revealing a room filled with dust and decay. "Look at this," Emily said, picking up a tattered journal from a rickety table. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening with each entry. It's a diary. It talks about the settlers who disappeared. They were trying to escape something evil. Mark's eyes scanned the room, landing on a series of strange symbols carved into the walls. "This place gives me the creeps. We should get out of here." But as they turned to leave, they heard a faint, familiar voice. "Help me, Tom," Emily called out, her heart racing. "Is that you?" They followed the voice to a small hidden room at the back of the cabin. There, huddled in the corner, was Tom. His eyes were wide with fear, and his skin was still unnaturally pale. "Tom, thank God we found you," Mark said, rushing to his side. "Are you okay?" Tom shook his head, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here. They're coming." "Who? Who's coming?" Emily asked. But before Tom could answer, the whispering began again, louder and more menacing than before. "We need to go, now," Mark shouted, pulling Tom to his feet. They raced back through the forest, the whispering voices growing louder with each step. When they finally reached the campsite, Jake and Sarah were already there, their faces etched with worry. "Did you find anything?" Jake asked, his eyes widening as he saw Tom. "Yeah, we found him," Mark said, out of breath, "but we need to leave." Now, as they hurriedly packed up their gear, the forest seemed to come alive with movement. Shadows flitted between the trees, and the whispering voices grew into a cacophony of terror. With Tom in tow, they fled the campsite, the horrors of the Dead Sea Forest hot on their heels. But as they ran, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, hunted by something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The discovery. The group moved quickly through the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. The whispering voices seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent with each step. Tom, still pale and shaken, stumbled along with the others, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. "We need to find a place to hide," Jake said, his voice tense. "We can't keep running like this." "There's an old cabin not far from here," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it when I was out there." "Lead the way," Sarah urged, her grip tightening on Tom's arm. They followed Tom through the dense underbrush, the forest closing in around them. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their path. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the cabin. It was old and decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it offered a semblance of shelter. Jake pushed open the door, and they hurried inside, barricading it behind them. The interior was dark and musty, filled with dust and cobwebs. An old fireplace stood in one corner, and a rickety table and chairs occupied the center of the room. "Let's see if we can find anything useful," Jake said. Lighting a lantern he found on a shelf, the dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls, but it was better than the oppressive darkness outside. As they searched the cabin, Emily found a stack of old papers on the table. "Look at this," she said, spreading them out. "These are letters from the settlers who disappeared. They talk about strange occurrences and sightings of the walking dead." Mark picked up one of the letters, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. They were trying to escape the forest, but something kept pulling them back. They mentioned a curse, something ancient and evil. Tom, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, suddenly spoke up. "I saw something out there. It wasn't just the walking dead. There was something else, something controlling them." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Tom's eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know what it was, but it felt like it was watching me, controlling everything. It's like the forest itself is alive." Jake frowned, his mind racing. "We need to find out more about this curse. There has to be a way to break it." As they continued to search the cabin, they found more clues about the forest's dark history. Old books and journals spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of ancient spirits that demanded offerings. The settlers had tried to appease these spirits, but it had only made things worse. "We need to find the source of the curse," Jake said, his voice resolute. "If we can break it, maybe we can stop all of this." "But how do we do that?" Mark asked, his face pale. "We don't even know where to start." Emily pointed to a map she had found in one of the journals. "This shows the location of an old altar deep in the forest. It looks like the settlers believed it was the source of the curse." "Then that's where we need to go," Jake said, determination in his eyes. "We have to find that altar and put an end to this." As they prepared to leave the cabin, the whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening. The forest seemed to come alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees. But the group was resolute. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in confronting the source of the curse and breaking it once and for all. With the map in hand and their hearts steeled for the journey ahead, they set out into the forest once more, determined to uncover the dark secrets of the Dead Sea Forest and put an end to the terror that had haunted them. The haunting. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ventured deeper, following the map's directions to the old altar. The whispering voices had grown louder, a constant, unnerving presence that gnawed at their nerves. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made them jump, their fear palpable. Tom, still pale and shaken, walked in the middle of the group. Flanked by Sarah and Emily, Jake led the way, the map clutched tightly in his hand, while Mark brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "We're getting close," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The altar should be just up ahead." As they approached a clearing, the air grew colder and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their path. The trees seemed to loom over them, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch them away. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of their presence. "There it is," Emily said, pointing to a stone structure in the center of the clearing. The altar was ancient, covered in moss and vines, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It exuded an aura of malevolence, a palpable sense of dread that made their skin crawl. "We need to figure out how to break the curse," Jake said, stepping closer to the altar. "There has to be something here that can help us." As they examined the altar, they found more clues about the forest's dark history. The symbols on the stone seemed to tell a story of ancient rituals and sacrifices, of spirits that demanded offerings in exchange for protection. The settlers had tried to appease these spirits, but it had only made things worse. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a series of symbols that seemed to form a pattern. "It looks like a ritual. Maybe if we perform it, we can break the curse." "But what if it makes things worse?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. What if it angers the spirits even more? We don't have a choice. Jake said, determination in his eyes. We have to try. They gathered around the altar, following the instructions they had deciphered from the symbols. As they began the ritual, the whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, obscuring their vision. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the trees seemed to come alive, their branches reaching out to ensnare them. The whispering voices turned into screams, a cacophony of terror that echoed through the forest. "Keep going," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "We have to finish the ritual." As they chanted the final words, a blinding light erupted from the altar, illuminating the clearing. The ground stopped shaking and the trees fell silent. The whispering voices faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. For a moment, it seemed as if they had succeeded. But then a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the same entity that had haunted Tom. The malevolent force that controlled the walking dead. "You cannot break the curse," the figure hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "You are too late." The group backed away, their hearts pounding with fear. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "We fight," Jake said, his eyes steely with determination. "We fight for our lives." As the entity advanced, the group prepared to make their final stand. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in confronting the malevolent force and breaking the curse once and for all. The forest had revealed its darkest secret, and now they had to face it head-on. The escape plan. The malevolent entity loomed before them, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. The group stood frozen, their hearts pounding with fear. The forest had fallen silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. "We can't fight this thing," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "You're right. We need to find a way to escape the forest, but we can't just run blindly. We need a plan." Sarah glanced at the map they had found earlier. There might be another way out. The settlers mentioned a hidden path that leads to safety. If we can find it, we might have a chance. "Let's do it," Emily said, her voice filled with determination. "We can't stay here." They quickly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the clearing. The entity watched them with a malevolent grin, its presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispering voices returned, growing louder and more insistent. "We need to stick together," Jake said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we can't let ourselves get separated." The group moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The forest seemed to come alive with movement, the trees rustling and swaying as if trying to trap them. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, as if the forest itself was trying to drive them mad. "Look!" Sarah pointed to a faint trail that wound through the trees. "This must be the hidden path. We need to follow it." They hurried along the trail, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. The path was narrow and overgrown, making it difficult to navigate. But they pressed on, driven by the hope of finding safety. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispering voices grew louder, almost unbearable. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their path. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch them away. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We just need to keep going." But as they neared the end of the trail, they encountered a series of obstacles. Fallen trees blocked their path, and the ground became treacherous, filled with hidden pitfalls and traps. The whispering voices grew louder, almost mocking, as if the forest itself was trying to stop them. "We can't give up now," Emily said, her voice filled with resolve. "We have to keep going." With a renewed sense of determination, they pushed forward, overcoming each obstacle in their path. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, but they refused to be deterred. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in escaping the forest and breaking the curse once and for all. Finally, they reached the end of the trail, emerging into a small clearing. The air was still and silent, the whispering voices finally fading away. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone archway covered in moss and vines. "This must be it," Jake said, his voice filled with hope. The way out. As they approached the archway, the ground beneath them began to tremble and the air grew colder. The malevolent entity appeared before them, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "The curse will never be broken." But the group refused to be deterred. With a final burst of determination, they stepped through the archway, leaving the forest and its horrors behind. As they emerged into the sunlight, they felt a sense of relief and triumph. They had faced the malevolent force and survived, but they knew that their journey was far from over. They still had to find a way to break the curse and ensure that the horrors of the Dead Sea Forest would never return. The betrayal. The group emerged from the forest, their hearts pounding with relief. The sunlight felt warm and reassuring on their skin, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive darkness they had left behind. But their sense of triumph was short-lived. They knew that the curse was still looming over them, and they had to find a way to break it. "We need to figure out our next move," Jake said, his voice steady. "We can't let our guard down." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We should find a safe place to rest and regroup. We need to come up with a plan." They found a small clearing not far from the forest's edge and set up a makeshift camp. As they settled in, the tension among the group was palpable. The events of the past few days had taken a toll on them, and the strain was beginning to show. Tom, who had been quiet since their escape, suddenly spoke up. "I think I know how to break the curse," he said, his voice trembling, "but it's not going to be easy." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Tom took a deep breath. "When I was out there, I saw something. An old book, hidden in the cabin. It had instructions on how to perform a ritual to break the curse, but it requires a sacrifice." "A sacrifice?" Mark repeated, his face pale. "What kind of sacrifice?" Tom's eyes were filled with fear. "A life! The curse can only be broken by offering a life to the spirits." The group fell silent, the weight of Tom's words sinking in. The idea of sacrificing one of their own was unthinkable, but they knew that they had to do something to break the curse. "We can't do that," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Tom insisted. "It's the only way. We have to make a choice." As the group debated their options, the tension between them grew. Trust began to erode, and suspicion took its place. Each of them wondered if they could be the one chosen for the sacrifice, and the fear of betrayal hung heavy in the air. "We need to stick together," Jake said, trying to keep the group united. We can't let this tear us apart. But it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and the group was on the brink of collapse. As night fell, they huddled around the campfire, each lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing. The group tensed, their eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice steady. A figure emerged from the shadows, and the group gasped in shock. It was one of the settlers, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You cannot escape the curse," the figure hissed. "One of you must be sacrificed." Panic set in as the group realized the gravity of their situation. They knew that they had to make a choice, but the thought of sacrificing one of their own was unbearable. As the night wore on, the tension reached a breaking point. Mark, driven by fear and desperation, made a fateful decision. He grabbed a knife from his pack and lunged at Tom, his eyes wild with terror. "Mark, no!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The knife plunged into Tom's chest, and he fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. The group watched in horror as Tom's life slipped away, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, as if the forest itself was mocking them. But as Tom's life ebbed away, the air grew still, and the whispering voices faded. The curse had been broken, but at a terrible cost. The group was left to grapple with the consequences of their actions, forever changed by the horrors they had faced. The final stand. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like a physical force. Tom's lifeless body lay at their feet, a stark reminder of the terrible cost of breaking the curse. The air was thick with tension and unspoken guilt. "We did what we had to do," Jake said, his voice hollow, "but we can't stay here. We need to move." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Let's go. We need to get as far away from this place as possible." They gathered their belongings and set off, leaving the clearing and its horrors behind. The forest was eerily silent, the whispering voices finally gone, but the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. As they walked, the group struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The betrayal and sacrifice had left deep scars, and trust was in short supply. Each step felt heavy, the weight of their guilt and fear slowing them down. "We need to find a way to make this right," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can't just leave Tom behind like this." "We don't have a choice," Mark said, his face pale. "We did what we had to do to survive." "But at what cost?" Sarah asked, her eyes filled with anguish. "We sacrificed one of our own. How can we live with that?" Jake stopped and turned to face the group. "We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it wasn't in vain. We need to find a way to ensure that the curse is truly broken and that no one else has to suffer." As they continued their journey, they came across an old, overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over them. "This must be the way to the source of the curse," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to follow it and make sure that the curse is truly broken." The group moved cautiously along the path, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves made their hearts race. As they neared the end of the path, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, similar to the one they had seen before. But this one was different. It was surrounded by a circle of standing stones, each carved with strange symbols. "This must be the source of the curse," Emily said, her voice filled with awe and fear. "We need to perform the ritual here to ensure that it's truly broken." They gathered around the altar, following the instructions they had deciphered from the symbols. As they began the ritual, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their vision. The ground beneath them trembled, and the trees seemed to come alive, their branches reaching out to ensnare them. "Keep going!" Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "We have to finish the ritual." As they chanted the final words, a blinding light erupted from the altar, illuminating the clearing. The ground stopped shaking, and the trees fell silent. The air grew still, and the fog began to dissipate. For a moment it seemed as if they had succeeded, but then the malevolent entity appeared before them, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You cannot break the curse," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "You are too late." The group backed away, their hearts pounding with fear. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "We fight," Jake said, his eyes steely with determination. "We fight for our lives." As the entity advanced, the group prepared to make their final stand. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in confronting the malevolent force and breaking the curse once and for all. The forest had revealed its darkest secret, and now they had to face it head-on. With a final burst of determination, they charged at the entity, their hearts filled with resolve. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the sounds of struggle and defiance. But the group refused to give up, their determination unwavering. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the entity let out a final anguished scream and dissipated into the air. The forest fell silent, the curse finally broken. The group stood in the clearing, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but they knew that the scars of their journey would stay with them forever. The aftermath. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the clearing. The group stood in silence, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the scars of their journey would stay with them forever. "We did it," Jake said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "The curse is finally broken," Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "But at what cost? We lost Tom. We can't forget that." Emily placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We won't forget, but we have to believe that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. We broke the curse, and now we can make sure that no one else has to suffer." Mark, who had been silent since the battle, finally spoke up. "We need to get out of here. We need to go home." The group gathered their belongings and began the long journey back to civilization. The forest, once filled with malevolent whispers and shadows, now seemed peaceful and serene. The air was filled with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves, a stark contrast to the horrors they had faced. As they walked, they reflected on their journey and the lessons they had learned. They had faced their deepest fears and come out stronger for it. But they knew that the road to healing would be long and difficult. When they finally emerged from the forest, they were greeted by the sight of a small village. The villagers, who had heard the legends of the cursed forest, welcomed them with open arms. They provided food, shelter, and medical care, helping the group to recover from their ordeal. As they rested and healed, the group began to share their story with the villagers. They spoke of the malevolent entity, the walking dead, and the ancient curse that had haunted the forest for generations. The villagers listened in awe and gratitude, thankful that the curse had finally been broken. "We need to make sure that the forest is protected," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let this happen again." The villagers agreed, and together they devised a plan to safeguard the forest and its secrets. They marked the boundaries of the cursed area and placed warning signs to deter anyone from venturing too close. They also performed rituals to honor the spirits and ensure that the curse would never return. As the days turned into weeks, the group began to heal, both physically and emotionally. They found solace in the support of the villagers and in each other. The bonds they had formed during their ordeal grew stronger, and they knew that they would always be connected by their shared experience. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, Jake spoke up. "We need to go back and give Tom a proper burial. He deserves that." The group agreed, and the next morning they set out for the forest once more. This time the journey felt different. The forest, once filled with fear and darkness, now seemed to welcome them. The air was filled with a sense of peace and closure. When they reached the clearing where Tom had fallen, they gathered around and held a small ceremony to honor his memory. They spoke of his bravery and sacrifice, and they vowed to never forget the lessons they had learned. As they laid Tom to rest, the forest seemed to come alive with a sense of gratitude and peace. The whispering voices were gone, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the songs of birds. The curse had been broken, and the forest was finally at peace. With heavy hearts but a sense of closure, the group made their way back to the village. They knew that their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it, and they knew that they could overcome anything as long as they stood together.